Hey, it's Mr. Shrum, and I'm back with a biology tutorial, and I think this is going to be the last one before the semester ends. And next week is intersession, so get ready to relax for another week, and then we'll start second semester next week. But right now, we're going to talk about mitosis and meiosis, the two ends of cell division. Here's all the content, and then let's get into the warm-up. All right, so the image shows a process called vegetative reproduction, in which a new plant grows from a part of another plant. Which statement is true about the offspring formed by this process? So we start out with this plant, and then we wind up with something else. And out of all of these options, it's genetically identical to its parent. So we're going to get into genetics. Vegetative reproduction occurs asexually and involves only one parent. The offspring of vegetative reproduction is genetically identical to its parent plant. Next warm-up question. What do you think the term genetic variation means? How does genetic variation help a species survive? Well, if you break those two words up, or just look at them individually, we have genetic, meaning the specific gene varies, variation. So there are different forms of a gene, and that is because they have these things called alleles. Depending on the alleles, the genes will be slightly different. So the genetic variation results in multiple combinations of the specific gene among members of a species. And this variation makes it possible for a species to exhibit various traits related to that specific gene. Having a variety of traits can help species adapt to different environmental conditions over time. So gene variation means a species can have different versions of the same gene, and it can test out which ones are better suited for certain environments. And then those will be more likely to be passed on. So let's get into the actual lesson now, starting with the types of reproduction. All species of plants, animals, fungi, and single-celled organisms that we see today have survived because of their ability to reproduce. They reproduce to create offspring so the species can survive. Each species reproduces differently, but the ability to create offspring is a characteristic of all living things. While reproductive behaviors differ among species, there are two main types of reproduction. We have asexual reproduction. A means not before a word as a prefix. So that means not sexual reproduction. And then we have sexual reproduction. Most species reproduce either asexually or sexually. For example, most amoebas and hydras reproduce asexually, and humans reproduce sexually. Many species, such as brittle stars and honeybees, use both methods of reproduction. This section will explore the types of reproduction. So first, we have asexual reproduction. Unicellular organisms, such as bacteria, generally reproduce asexually. Plants, such as strawberries, often reproduce asexually, although they can also reproduce sexually. Asexual reproduction requires only one parent, which creates an offspring genetically identical to the parent. It's like making a copy. One advantage of asexual reproduction is that the organism doesn't need to find a mate. The primary disadvantage of asexual reproduction is lower genetic variation because the offspring receives an identical set of genes from the parent. So they're just making copies of themselves, essentially. There's not a lot of cross-pollination of genes. And consider a crop of genetically identical plants. If a disease hits that crop, all of the plants might die because they're all equally susceptible to the disease because of their genetic variation being very similar. Now consider a crop of genetically verified or genetically varied plants. That means they have different genes, but of the same species. When a disease hits these types of crops, there's a chance that some plants might survive. These plants might have genes that protect them from the disease. So those are some of the main differences that genetic variation can actually help plants or species survive. And let's discuss the different types of asexual reproduction. First, we have mitosis. Mitosis is a type of cell division where a single cell becomes two genetically identical cells. It's common in single-celled eukaryotes. Mitosis also occurs in humans. Our cells actually divide by mitosis. And mitosis creates multiple copies of cells after fertilization, which helps the zygote grow. Mitosis occurs in most sexually reproducing organisms to help them grow and repair damaged tissues. So we have one becoming two of the same genetically identical cells. And then we have binary fission. Most prokaryotic organisms like bacteria reproduce asexually through binary fission. During binary fission, a cell copies its DNA. The cell elongates itself, gets longer and longer, and by pulling the two DNA copies away from each other toward the polar ends, polar means the very opposite ends, the cytoplasm, as you can see here, divides equally, and the plasma membrane pinches inward, enclosing the DNA. This process creates two daughter cells. Each daughter cell later grows to the size of its parent cell. So one cell divides into two smaller cells, and then that cell, or those cells, grow to the normal size. And that's binary fission. Then we have budding, and that is common in some fungi and plants. During budding, the DNA divides equally and the cytoplasm divides unequally. DNA equal, cytoplasm not equal. And this process leads to a small outgrowth or bud, which contains a full set of the replicated DNA from the parent. In some organisms, the bud gradually detaches from the parent cell, while in other organisms like hydras, the bud remains attached throughout its life. So that's the little bud. Then we have vegetative propagation, and this occurs in plants. Vegetative meaning plants, vegetation. In this process, a new plant grows from a specialized part like a leaf, tuber, or root without producing any seeds or spores. A plant can be grafted, or parts of a parent plant can be sown and allowed to propagate. The part has the ability to develop roots under the correct environmental conditions, allowing it to grow into a new plant. Old potatoes developing stems and onions developing buds are examples of vegetative propagation. And here we see how older potatoes start sprouting these stems. And then we have regeneration. Some animals can regenerate a lost body part. For example, lobsters are capable of growing a new claw in place of a lost claw. A few organisms like starfish can form a whole new organism from a severed body part. Starfish usually reproduce asexually by a process called fission, in which the central disc between the arms breaks in two pieces and grows into two organisms. If just one of a starfish's arms is broken off because of an accident in the ocean, it's possible for a single arm to regenerate into a whole new organism. For most species of starfish, the arm needs to be broken off with part of the central axis attached for this regeneration to occur. Sexual reproduction. Almost all eukaryotic organisms reproduce sexually. Sexual reproduction involves the fusion of two distinct gametes, sperm and an egg. So it does require two parents. Sperm is the male reproductive cell, while an egg is known as a female reproductive cell. Sexual reproduction requires more time and energy because an organism needs to find a mate. Each species reaches sexual maturity at a different age, after which it can reproduce. Sexual reproduction does have some advantages. Offspring born through sexual reproduction inherits genetic material from each parent. However, the offspring's overall genotype is not identical to either. This process leads to greater genetic variation, which helps organisms adapt to environmental changes. Some organisms reproduce both sexually and asexually. This ability gives them an evolutionary advantage. These organisms can achieve genetic variation through sexual reproduction. Alternatively, if conditions require them to reproduce quickly, then they can switch over and reproduce asexually, saving time and energy. So that seems like a very adaptable thing to be able to do. Most flowering plants reproduce sexually through pollination. Many plants can also reproduce asexually through vegetative propagation. Some species of planarians and annelids, such as blackworms, reproduce sexually and also asexually through regeneration. Some species of wasps, ants, and fleas reproduce sexually and also asexually through parthenogenesis, or parthenogenesis is probably the best way to pronounce that. Parthenogenesis involves the creation of a zygote without fertilization of the ovum. And in this way, the species can continue reproduction even in the absence of a mate. Here we have a honeybee, or a bumblebee, pollinating a flower. Now we have two pictures that show two organisms in the process of reproduction. Match each description to the correct organism. So we have butterflies and some type of budding Here, let's see if I can unanswer. We have the butterfly, and then we have hydra. And if we put back the answer key, we have the butterflies mating sexually reproduction, or sexual reproduction. As we talked about, that leads to higher genetic variation, and the offspring will be genetically different from the parents. But with the hydra, this is asexual reproduction. That means the genetic variation is lower because it's just copying the same genetic information. And then the offspring will be genetically identical to the parent. All right, excellent. And that's where I'll leave it today. And then next time we'll pick up at cell division. But until then, thank you guys for tuning into the lesson, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.